In this lecture, we're looking at holiness and restoration movements after the Second Great Awakening. And I'm going to go ahead and warn you that this lecture is going to feel like there are a number of different elements and different threads that are coming together here that don't always fit. That is certainly the case, and we're going to say right now, not all the things that we're talking about in this lecture stem from a single source, a single cause, or a single church tradition or influence here in the 19th century. However, what we're seeing in the 19th century, coming out of the Second Great Awakening and the impact of the American Revolution onto the church, is a number of different trends that do come together, at least in terms of the instincts of just about everyone involved. As the title of this lecture indicates, we're talking about holiness and restoration movements, movements that are part of the church that spill out of different denominations and out of the revivals of the Second Great Awakening, that all share a common concern to restore something to the church, whether through personal holiness or through the liberation of individuals, that they believed was mandated and required because of the gospel. And we're going to go ahead and frame this up, make sure that we understand where all of this is coming from. In our last several lectures, of course, we've just looked at the developments of the awakening spirit and how the anti-institutional and emotional revivalism of not only the First Great Awakening, but the Second Great Awakening in particular, came to match up with this American ethos of rugged individualism. The strong desire of many people in the church, at least those who participated in the awakenings, was to see a change in society, a return to the Bible, and a return to holiness, and an idealized restoration of the church body and of the life of the church to a pristine, idealized understanding of the church's role in the lives of individuals in local communities as well as in the nation as a whole. Other factors that are playing into this is that there are rampant and widespread health problems all throughout the countries that are becoming industrialized. This is true in Europe and America. Any country that begins to become involved with the Industrial Revolution ends up finding itself plagued with all types of health issues that they did not have necessarily before. And you really only have to think about Charles Dickens and some of his tales of, for example, Oliver Twist, or of people working in sweatshops there in the heart of London. Well, these are real realities. What Dickens is talking about here is a true perspective that was occurring in the lives of a number of different people in the working classes. Put simply, when people move from farms and a more agrarian lifestyle to working in things like coal mines, steel mines, around major equipment, to say nothing of the fumes and the pollutants that they are breathing in or drinking and these kinds of things, as well as the way that the Industrial Revolution tends to corrupt things like water sources or food sources. The Industrial Revolution, of course, is always maligned for this, and rightly so. But of course, in this day and age, they knew so very little about the state of health and the ways to address these problems that so very often there were widespread health issues, chronic pain. As the 1800s wear on, we move from a time where they don't even have aspirin or penicillin or some of the basics that you and I can buy over the counter. And by the end, of course, they are starting to make strides that will blossom in the 20th century with some of the great advantages and leaps forward that we've come to enjoy today. In this day, though, there really is nothing. Health is at an all-time low, you might say. There is a lack of anything like stable medical practice. They're doing their best, of course, and so people by and large did not believe that doctors were incompetent or that they lacked a basic fundamental knowledge of what was going on with the human body. They all assumed that they were the best and the brightest. However, there were significant problems health-wise, lung issues, blood issues, all types of things, chronic diseases, local outbreaks of influenza, and these types of things that just seemed to always pull at the thread of those who believed that the world was getting better and better by stages. For many, as a result of the health problems of the Industrial Revolution, it sometimes felt like they were back in the Middle Ages. The other thing, and the last thing that frames up what we're about to talk about in this lecture, is that there is an increased awareness by a number of people in society, and in particular in the church, about the number of social ills that are plaguing, in particular, America. And since what we're focusing on here is the American context and the American church, we can say pretty flat out, people didn't really have their head in the sands when it came to the problems of society. Evangelicals increasingly, particularly those who came from the Holiness and Methodist movements, were concerned about slavery. They wanted abolition. But it extended beyond that. They were concerned about drunkenness, about the ways that people were damaging themselves or harming themselves through poor diet, long work hours, and working in unfavorable environments. And as we'll see, there were a number of people who were beginning to challenge the plight of women, not only in things like prostitution and sexual slavery, but also in terms of their voice and their vote within society at large. So you might say this, with all these, again, framing concepts, these contextual issues forming the backdrop of the 19th century, what begins to happen is the 19th century in the church becomes a time of, as we've already mentioned in previous lectures, an ironic mix of pessimism and utopianism. On the one hand, there is a great deal of pessimism in the church. People believe that things are not getting better, that things are actually getting worse, that society has locked itself up with a number of these social ills or personal health issues, and that there is no real energy at work in society to change these things. So there's a great deal of pessimism. However, again, as we've seen, always when there's a pessimism in the context of the Great Awakenings in particular, there is always on the other side of this a more or less utopian ideal as to what we can do to recover these things. If the world is falling apart, if there's a great deal of social ills that are out there in the world, well then, if we put the gospel to work, and if we work hard as Christians, as evangelicals in this case, in America, then there can be real change. Now, from the standpoint of theological grammar, you might say, or from the vocabulary of the church, what syncs up with all these problems is the very Wesleyan idea of Christian perfection, which we've talked about before. It is from Wesley and Wesleyanism, of course, that this idea of Christian perfection takes root in the minds of evangelicals. Now, what Wesley was not a part of was the American culture. He was part of the English culture. And it's very interesting that the idea of Christian perfection within Wesley's world, within the British world, does not take on some of these same tones, some of these same ideals that we see happen in America. You might say, probably overly simplistically, but still it's worth saying, that Wesleyan perfectionism, when it pairs up with American individualism, that rugged individualism that we keep referring to, that it creates a different sort of organism or a different set of vocabularies and instincts within the church. And so as the Wesleyan theological grid is being expressed in the Second Great Awakening in particular, as Arminianism becomes more or less the default for the vast majority of evangelicals, that begins to spit out a number of different instincts and a number of different groups, some that are on the fringe and a bit obscure and weird, frankly, and some that are the forerunners of things that are still with us even to this day. And so we're going to take a kind of kaleidoscope view of all the different ways in the 19th century that holiness and restoration movements begin to pop up. But remember, the instinct here is there are problems in the world of any number of varieties, whether it's subjugation or health issues or whatnot, and this new idea of perfectionism and rugged individualism gets pressed into service to try to address these problems. And we can see right out of the gate, one of the more important and frankly obscure groups that comes out of the Second Great Awakening with this ideal of holiness and perfection is the Oneida Group, which is run by John Humphrey Noyes. And if you recognize that name Oneida, well, there's a good reason for that. The company, Oneida Limited, is actually still around to this day. They're a company that manufactures silverware, steel, and these types of things. Well, they get going as a result of Noyes and the Oneida Group's ideals of holiness and perfection. Now, of course, what we're about to say about the Oneida Group in its historical context has nothing to do with the modern understanding of the company, Oneida Limited. Well, John Humphrey Noyes was a man from Vermont. He had attended Dartmouth College, and he had come to Christ, during the Second Great Awakening. In particular, he was attracted to the ideas of Arminianism, of free choice, and of virility, you might say, this type of manly strength that he believed was part and parcel to the Second Great Awakening's understanding of the church. Now, in time, he begins to realize that others simply do not agree with him. He is sort of on the fringe with his theological views. And Noyes eventually forms a commune, you might say. In fact, it really is a socialist group, though that word is not really in play at this point. But Noyes is a man who likes to tear down all the traditional boundaries that limited people in the context of his day. Again, he's a radical. And Noyes forms the Oneida Group, and he calls them the perfectionists. He takes on that ideal that the Christian is supposed to live a perfect life, and he starts to develop a theology that goes along with it. And as he studies the scriptures on his own, of course, he has no training and he doesn't come from a theological tradition that would give him a set confession or standard understanding of some of the traditional doctrines. Noyes comes to the conclusion that actually all of this apocalyptic desire of people like the Millerites was a false prophecy, was not based on the scriptures. Noyes actually comes to the conclusion that the Bible was very clear that Christ was going to return by AD 70, by the year of the fall of Jerusalem. And this is an idea that we call preterism today. It's the idea that Christ did actually return. The belief that Noyes comes up with is that Christ came in judgment on the Jews, and therefore the age that we now live in is, you might say, the end times. Now, I have no idea why he believed that from a cultural standpoint, but he has all types of ways to convince himself of this principle. So he believes that Christ did come back in AD 70 in judgment. The city of Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70, and so as a result, perfection is possible now. We don't have to wait for heaven or for the resurrection, for the restoration of all things in full, but rather, because Christ did come back in AD 70, we can have perfection now. Now, the way that Noyes and the Oneida Group live this out is a bit strange. One of the more curious things that Noyes employs in his group is the idea that there should be no marriage. And he takes Christ's words here from the Gospels where he says that people in heaven will no longer give and receive in marriage. So Oneida, believing that we're in the eschaton, in the end times, says that marriage should be done away with. However, though, again, because he's breaking down the traditional boundaries of society, Noyes believes that there ought to be free sexual relationships amongst all men and women within the community. And it's not exactly a swingers convention, they're not orgies, but rather the idea here is that there is no marriage, but that men and women, if they have a desire for one another, can have sex. It's possible, it's allowable. They're not to be married, of course, but sexual relationships are to be encouraged so long as the two people are consenting. The strangest part of this, though, is that Noyes had this idea of male virility, of strength, of this perfect life that could be achieved, in particular amongst the men. And so he stipulated that men, during the act of sex, must not ejaculate. They must have sort of a chaste sexual relationship. They are there for the pleasure of the women, not for themselves, and so therefore ejaculation is forbidden. The only time ejaculation is allowed is whenever there is a decision that there ought to be children born to the community. And often this decision to have children is a form of eugenics, which is the idea that there are superior genes or traits amongst certain people, and they would more or less select the right man and the right woman to have the best offspring for their community. Well, in the end, Oneida and Noyes do not live on as a religious community for much longer. It's just simply too hard to get converts to this, frankly. They had about 300 when it was originally founded, but it died out within about a generation or two. The reason that something called Oneida Limited continued on, though, was that the community living and sharing everything in common had to develop a trade set. And one of the things that they got very good at was the production of manufactured goods like cutlery, silverware, and a number of different smaller applications of steel and metal. So, for example, in the early 1900s, Oneida becomes very good at making surgical steel for forceps and these types of things. So the company goes on from this, but the religious community dies out in about a year or two. Well, already right there, you can see the same impulse that we were just talking about. The issues are that there is something wrong in the world, that there can be an idealized utopian society, a group, and there's this idea of new insights, in fact, anti-institutional radical insights, where people are trying to find new avenues and new perspectives in the scriptures to justify where their beliefs are taking them. Meaning there is no longer a power base of the pastors, the elders, the bishops, whoever it might be, depending on the denomination, who are the people in charge of verifying the truth or falsity of new interpretations of texts. This anti-institutional, anti-authoritarian ideal always comes home to roost whenever a group like this comes about and they espouse new ideas. People are just simply unable to put a stop to it. When we turn to the issue of health, though, the problems of clean living, holiness, and virility, we see a number of different things that come to bear on the American church in particular that are very new, of course, but come out of the same ethos, come out of the same context. Simply put, the early evangelicals in the 19th century those coming out of the Second Great Awakening, hold some of the views that people, frankly, today would not associate with evangelicalism. Actually, what we're going to see here is that evangelicals are amongst the first, if not the very first, to embrace things like vegetarianism, fruitarianism, what would eventually be called clean living, which is, of course, a focus on diet and what to eat and what not to eat, which it seems everybody in the American world or the Western world is now doing. Well, in the context of where it arises, evangelicals get involved with clean living or healthy living, a healthy lifestyle, as a result of, as we've said, the rampant health problems, which evangelicals were beginning to interpret as a scourge or a sign of God's disfavor. Still, though, those coming out of the holiness movement, those coming out of the Second Great Awakening, really intensified their view of the way we ought to use our bodies as God's temple and the way our diet ought to be used for the glory of God. So, for example, there was Sylvester Graham. He lived from 1794 to 1851, and he is one of these more aggressive prophets against unclean living and the wiles of the devil in terms of our diet. Graham is notoriously aggressive when it comes to temperance. He's one of the most vigorous, in fact, against the sale or the consumption of alcohol. He also had a curious view about flour. He thought that bleaching flour or using processed flour was a sign of the end times, you might say. Not really, but he just sees it as a blight upon the world. And he starts to champion the idea that you ought to eat unprocessed, kind of dry, what we call today whole wheat flours of different kinds, in particular rye. And he wrote a number of books on this that were highly influential, both within Christian circles as well as those who were not Christian. And there are a number of production companies and food companies, some of which are still around today, morphed into different entities or various groups. One of them, of course, being Kellogg, who buy into some of Graham's ideas. Graham's legacy is also there for any of us who have kids, because Graham is the inventor of the graham cracker. Now, in its day, it didn't have a cute little bear and honey and cinnamon and all those amazing things. It was actually a pretty awful cracker. It was one of the worst crackers ever invented, let's just say it that way. It was made from this really awful, really unprocessed rye flour. It was kind of this stiff cracker that was supposed to clean out your insides and provide moral vigor and integrity for the body. Graham didn't wrap this up into a theology per se or into a different denomination. He was just hardcore about healthy living and clean lifestyle. And the diet of Christians, he said, ought to be a specific diet that is different from the world around us. Others do wrap this up into their denominational trends, though. There's, for example, Ellen White. And Ellen is instrumental in the founding of what we call today the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, we need to make a clear distinction here. We talked about Adventists or Adventist theology or the movement of Adventism in a previous lecture, that it comes out of the Millerite movement, etc. The Seventh-day Adventists are a different group. They were rejected by the majority of the Adventists, and they broke off and formed their own perspectives on not only theology in the Bible and on the end times, but also here on the role of diet and healthy living. Ellen White is one of actually the first and the most vigorous vegans to come onto the scene. She argues that vegan living is part of the preparatory process as we wait for the coming of Messiah. She actually eventually, more or less on the side, not part of the denomination itself, but she does start it based on her theological principles. She starts a sanatorium. And it's this place where people are supposed to come and practice healthy living and all these kinds of things. And a number of people actually come, the names of whom are still around today: J.C. Penney, Montgomery Ward, big influential businessmen who will go on to shape all kinds of things in the 20th century. And to sort of round this out, one of the last movements that is pretty important throughout the history of the 19th and 20th centuries is the YMCA movement. Now, the YMCA movement gets going in Europe. It actually gets going in London and Switzerland, and its base of operations has always been in Europe. It's not an American entity per se. However, in the American context, the YMCA has always synced up with this holiness movement. The YMCA begins to move into the American context around this same time, and it provided an opportunity, a space, for clean living, activities, sports, exercise, no alcohol in sight, and a real wholesome, you might say, application of what young Christian men, hence the name YMCA, were supposed to be doing with their free time. When we transition now, though, to the problems of social ills, what we're going to be talking about now are a number of different instincts and impulses that seek to address the problems of society on a number of different fronts. But we have to understand that what's going on here are the same principles. of overthrowing the ills of society, following the gospel's lead in terms of social justice, and in the end, righting the wrongs so that individuals can have the free choice and the opportunity to have advancement in life, health, and society. And the two most important social ills that are being addressed in the American context in the 19th century are the abolition of slavery and the relationships between men and women. Now, the abolitionist movement is well known. Of course, in the 19th century, in the run up to the Civil War, there are a number of voices, not just Christian, but certainly within the Christian world, who are calling for an end to the slave trade. They feel that it is a moral blight, a judgment upon the American nation, that they would continue to do this after they have proclaimed the liberty of all people. So in the 19th century, this is the time of Susan B. Anthony, as well as a number of others. And we've said this before, so we're only going to say it briefly here. The role of evangelicals in the suffragan movement, in the anti-slavery movement, is not always appreciated or recognized. And part of the reason it's overlooked, of course, is that there were a number of Christians who argued in favor of slavery. And so often the attention goes on them, and they're frankly very bad arguments for the continuation of the slave trade. However, there were a number of folks, both in the North and the South, who coming out of the Second Great Awakening began to feel that abolition was the required stance of anyone who believes in the gospel. Now, here's one of the curious things. Often those people who are the loudest voices calling for abolition are those who are wrapped up into this anti-institutional, anti-authoritarian stance that has come out of the Second Great Awakening. So it is one of the curious things that those who have the loudest voices and frankly the best arguments for the ending of slavery have set themselves at times over against the societal structures, over against clergy and bishops, and certainly over against the political rulers in general, often slamming the society of the evil world around them. And they did this often so much that their message was attenuated. It was curtailed. So, for example, and we see this when we transition now to the issue of men and women, one of the more important groups that comes to defend abolition and calls for the ending of slavery is actually the societies of women that are born out of the evangelical desire for holiness. Perhaps the most important of these groups, and one of the more famous, given a very popular picture that has gone over social media on a number of occasions, is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And this got underway by Frances Willard, but Frances Willard was not simply about temperance. Her goal was the eradication of all types of social ills. So she took on temperance, yes, and she did so not so much because she hated alcohol per se, though of course she did, but because she believed that the home was being ravaged by so many parents, and in particular so many fathers, spending all their times down at the bars after 14-hour workdays, getting roaring drunk, and often being very violent after doing so. What Frances Willard does, in other words, is she takes the temperance movement, this women's group, and she partners up with all types of other groups and other social issues that she believes are part and parcel of the same syndrome. So she gets involved, for example, with the attempt to end prostitution, which was just rampant now in these increased industrialized urban centers. And she refers to it as a form of white slavery, that these women, with no recourse to jobs or any other types of things for themselves, eventually resort to prostitution. Her work, though, in what we call today sex trafficking, as well as in temperance, actually made her and others natural partners and companions to people like Susan B. Anthony. And so the women's Christian temperance movement is frankly very vocal about its support of abolition. And here's the thing. Too often it's believed that women's rights and the feminist movement, so to speak, is a 20th century product or a product maybe of the 1960s. Maybe there were some precursors in the 40s and 50s in Paris or things like this. But we often believe that the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement were things that came about in the mid-20th century. Actually, it started about 100 years before. It starts actually here in this temperance movement. There are a lot of very famous pictures and a lot of very famous women who are just bucking the trend here. Perhaps the most famous is Carrie Nation, a somewhat grumpy-looking woman, to be honest, who was frequently depicted carrying an axe around. Now, I'm not sure what the axe was for. Maybe she believed that she was symbolizing taking an axe to the root of all of society's ills. But it certainly was very imposing and ominous to anyone who came across her face to face. Well, a number of different things in favor of women's rights in the home and in society actually date back to the Second Great Awakening. In 1849, for example, Lucretia Mott published a book called The Discourse on Women. There was actually a National Women's Rights Convention, which was a Christian convention. It was brought together frankly, to argue the biblical position as to whether or not the subjugation of women in the home and in the church, the silencing of their voices, was actually biblical or not. And they are aggressive. If you go look up the texts and the writings of this time, they are not sugarcoating their position here. They say things like, quote, "It is not Christianity that has subjugated women. Church and state have been united, and it is well to see it so." Others during this convention stand up and vocally and publicly debate men on the question of the Bible's understanding of the role of the subjugation of women. And a lot of this comes from an American and Victorian English understanding of what the woman's role was to be. And a lot of this is, frankly, colored and renewed in the context of this world. Now, obviously, the world had always been somewhat patriarchal, but there are different types of patriarchy, frankly. In the 19th century, the accent was always that men go off into this kind of murky, awful, sin plagued world, into the marketplace, that they work there and they slog it out and they exert all of their energy. And the women are seen more or less on a pedestal. They're not seen as servants per se. They're seen as the holy, almost monkish people, the nuns living back at home, though obviously not nuns in the sense of celibacy. And so they were supposed to remain there. And the idea was that men come home and they are nurtured in the womb of this loving kindness of the woman's place. So there was actually, in the Victorian and in the 19th century American context, a real sort of calcification of a number of different cultural instincts as to the roles of men and women. So in some cases, the fight here in the 19th century is not about overthrowing all of society per se in terms of the roles of men and women. Rather, women are in part reacting against the Victorian understanding of patriarchy. However, there were those who fought against the structure as a whole. Perhaps the most important was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who in 1895, along with 26 other women, published the Women's Bible. And you might call this a study Bible. It's a text with notes that go along with it. And the notes, of course, are all dealing with the question of women. Stanton is more radical in terms of her theological position. She stresses the liberation of women almost full stop. The problem, though, in terms of the Bible's impact, is that she uses some of the more newer, higher critical understandings, form critical understandings of the Bible to achieve her ends. So she looks at the account of Genesis, for example, and it had become quite common about this point to argue that there were actually two different Genesis accounts, that perhaps it's two different authors that somehow mushed up their stories into one generic understanding of the creation account. Well, Stanton takes this line. She argues that the first comment about God creating male and female in his image is the appropriate one. And she argues, again, very progressively, that this indicates that the female soul, the differences that are there in women, mean that God has a feminine side to him as well as a masculine side. However, she then turns to what is alleged to be the second creation account, which is the taking of the rib out of Adam to form and fashion the woman. And she calls this vile filth. The idea that out of some DNA in man, that there has to be fashioned the throwaway materials that make up women. Well, as you can imagine, the Women's Bible dropped like a bomb on people. It was condemned as Satanist, repugnant, and all these types of things. One of the more unfortunate things, though, is that as a result of this Bible, Stanton and others, who had been natural companions and very good friends with Susan B. Anthony, and who had first fought for abolition and who were now fighting for equal rights for African Americans, end up being marginalized. Susan B. Anthony actually has to double back. African Americans and freed slaves now, those who were Christian, themselves did not like some of the arguments that were in the Women's Bible. They did not like some of the liberal overtones, some of the uses of form critical theory that had been used in this Bible. And so the movement for the cessation of oppression of women, as well as the civil rights movement, don't fully separate by any means. But just at a moment when we thought they were coming together in a very serious way, almost to unite entirely, you might say, there was actually a bit of a separation. In response, of course, the men doubled down on masculinity. There arose in the mid to late 1800s as a result of some of these texts being published by women, something that we call today muscular Christianity. And yeah, it's exactly like it sounds. It's this idea that Christianity is virile, it's muscular, it's about playing sports, about being athletic, and about being awesome. And you see, for example, campus ministries going on to different universities and looking for the athletes and trying to convert them. You see a lot of this idea about diet and healthy living and these kinds of things syncing up with this idea that the best kinds of Christians are the athletes, the real strong men, the real machismo stuff. And muscular Christianity was a very, very popular thing for a while. Not widespread by any means, but it certainly wasn't a fringe movement. And I think this, again, indicates the classic pendulum swing. Those who are fighters against social ills sometimes are met with the extreme opposite reaction. And in fact, one of the things that comes out of this muscular Christianity movement is a number of different written accounts as well as artistic, impressionistic accounts that start to show Jesus more and more, as many people in the modern world have gotten used to, unfortunately, of the big, white, strong, handsome Jesus. You ever wonder where that came from? Well, it frankly comes from this period of time. The idea that Jesus is strong and handsome, good looking, flowing mane of hair, bright blue eyes, all these kinds of things, becomes an ideal for some because as a result of holy living, they thought Jesus has to be the ideal. If our goal is to have this perfection, this healthy living, this kind of thing, then it only made sense to some of them to read that on top of Jesus. No longer a Jewish man, but now a sexy white guy with blue eyes and long flowing brown hair. In the end, the holiness and restoration movements that we've discussed in this lecture are really only the tip of the iceberg. And there are a number of others that are not even Christian that we can't go into. It should be no wonder that the Mormon movement and the Christian Science movement, both of which espouse many of the same ideals. In fact, Mary Baker Eddy, when she formed the foundational philosophies of Christian Science, for a time believed that you couldn't die if you just simply applied your mind to the right principles. And of course, Mormonism is very much a movement of holiness and perfectionism, though obviously run through a different account of the Bible, of Christ, of the atonement, and all kinds of different things. But is it any wonder, you might say, that in the context of the 19th century, so many groups, and even so many fringe groups that eventually leave Orthodox Christianity, become enamored with this idea that to be a Christian, you have to be holy and you have to be perfect?